The winter that nearly killed her was already known across the valley as the cruelest in living memory. A white, merciless season that swallowed fences, bent pine trees like broken spines, and silenced even the hardiest men. And Ethan Cole had survived it the same way he survived everything else, alone, stubborn and unnoticed, riding his horse through waist-deep snow before dawn, breath crystallizing in his beard as the sun rose weak and pale over the ranch he'd built with his own scarred hands, a ranch that had once echoed with laughter, but now only answered him with the groan of timber and the low, patient breath of cattle. And if anyone in the county still remembered how his wife had died, or why he never remarried, or why he spoke to animals more easily than people, they never said it to his face, because Ethan Cole had the kind of silence about him that warned others away, a silence forged from loss and sharpened by years of isolation. And on that particular morning, when the wind screamed like something alive and the snow fell sideways, he hadn't planned to ride toward the old Turner property at all. Not until he noticed the mailbox leaning crooked near the road, its red flag frozen upright like a distress signal, stuffed so full of unopened letters that snow had piled inside. And that was when he remembered Caleb Turner, his neighbor of nearly 20 years, a man he barely spoke to but nodded at out of habit, a man rumored to have ordered himself a wife from a catalog out east. Though Ethan had dismissed the gossip as lonely nonsense, yet something in the sight of that mailbox stirred unease in him, the kind that settled deep in the bones. And against his better judgment, he turned his horse toward the long-abandoned drive, passing drifts that reached the animal's chest, the house appearing at last through the white like a dying thing, windows dark, roof sagging, chimney cold, and the door hanging ajar, creaking softly in the wind. And Ethan dismounted with a hand already on his rifle, calling out once then again, his voice swallowed by the storm, stepping inside to find the air frozen solid and the smell of sickness lingering like a ghost. And there, on the narrow bed, lay Caleb Turner, thin as a shadow, eyes staring but seeing nothing, his hand clutching a bundle of letters bound with twine, frost crawling along the walls as if death itself had moved in early. And Ethan stood there longer than he should have, jaw clenched because he knew this sight too well, knew the look of a man who had died waiting for something that never came. And as he turned to leave, because he told himself there was nothing else to be done, because loneliness had taught him to retreat, his boot brushed against something near the back door, something half buried in snow, and when he pushed it aside, his breath caught because there, behind the house, huddled against the windbreak like an abandoned animal, was a woman wrapped in a thin coat soaked through and stiff with ice, her face pale blue, lashes white with frost, lips cracked and trembling, eyes fluttering weakly as if she'd already given up on being found. And for one terrifying moment, Ethan thought he was too late again, that fate had followed him out here just to mock him. But then her fingers twitched barely, and a sound escaped her throat. Not quite a word, not quite a cry, and something inside Ethan broke open, something he had nailed shut years ago. Because this woman was not from the valley, not dressed for this land or this cold, her shoes ruined, her hands raw, and clutched against her chest was a small leather bag holding papers already half destroyed by snow, the words marriage contract visible through the ice. And Ethan didn't think anymore, didn't weigh consequences or wonder how she had ended up here, or why a dying man had left her outside to freeze. He simply moved, lifting her with arms that shook despite his strength, feeling how frighteningly light she was, carrying her into the house, stripping off his own coat to wrap around her, building a fire with fingers numb and clumsy, forcing warmth back into a body that had nearly slipped away, whispering words he didn't remember learning as he pressed his hands against hers, counting breaths, willing life to stay. And when she finally gasped, sucking air like someone breaking the surface of deep water, tears burned his eyes without permission, because the storm outside raged on uncaring. But inside that broken house, something fragile and impossible had begun. A second chance neither of them had asked for. And as the fire crackled and the woman's breathing steadied, Ethan sat beside her on the floor, exhausted, staring at the flickering light, unaware that by stopping at a forgotten mailbox, by choosing not to ride past, he had just stepped onto a path that would test every scar he carried and change his fate forever. And if you're the kind of person who believes one small decision can alter an entire life, then stay with this story, because what happens next will remind you why hope sometimes arrives frozen, silent, and almost too late. And if you don't want to miss the next chapter of Ethan and the woman the world tried to abandon, Make sure you subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. She drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days, and Ethan barely slept through any of it, because every time the fire popped too loudly or the wind slammed against the walls, he feared she would stop breathing again, feared the fragile warmth he'd fought so hard to restore would slip away like everything else he'd ever tried to hold on to. And when she finally woke fully, it was not with words but with fear, her eyes flying open wide and wild, her body jerking upright with a gasp so sharp it tore at his chest, her hands clawing at the air as if the snow were still closing in on her. And Ethan reacted on instinct, stepping back, raising his palms slowly the way one does with a frightened horse, his voice low and steady as he told her she was safe, that she was inside, that the storm couldn't reach her now. But she didn't understand him at first, her lips moving in sounds he didn't recognize, her accent thick and trembling, panic flooding her face as she tried to stand and nearly collapsed. And it was only when he guided her gently back, down and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders that she seemed to register him, not as a threat, but as something solid, something real, and she stared at him for a long moment, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Before whispering a single word, he did understand, spoken so softly it nearly broke him. Alive. And the relief in her voice hit him harder than any accusation ever could. Because she had truly believed she was going to die out there, alone and forgotten, and as the hours passed and the fire burned low, he learned pieces of her story in broken phrases and gestures, learned that her name was Anya, that she had come from far away, across the ocean with nothing but a promise and a letter, written in careful handwriting, that she had answered an advertisement for a husband, because there was nothing left for her where she came from, no family, no future, only hunger and grief. And when she finally arrived at the train station weeks earlier, no one had been there to meet her, only directions scribbled on a scrap of paper, leading her through snow and silence to a house already claimed by sickness and death. And she told him, voice shaking, eyes lowered, that Caleb Turner had been kind at first, apologetic even, too weak to hide how ill he was, promising she would be cared for once spring came. But then the fever worsened, the money ran out, and the days blurred together until she realized too late that the man she was supposed to marry was dying, and she was stranded in a land that did not know her name. And Ethan listened without interruption, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides, not trusting himself to speak, because every word she said added weight to the shame, already pressing down on his chest. Shame for the times he'd ridden past this house without stopping, shame for assuming loneliness was always chosen. And when she finally asked him in a small, frightened voice what would happen to her now, Ethan had no answer ready, because the truth was complicated and sharp-edged, because the law would have questions, the town would gossip, and he was a man who had built his life around solitude for a reason. Yet when he looked at her, thin, exhausted, eyes still shadowed by terror, he couldn't imagine turning her out into the cold again, not after fate had dragged her half-dead into his path. And so he told her the only thing he knew for certain, that she would stay until she was strong, that no one would force her to leave before the snow melted, and that as long as she was under his roof, she would not be abandoned. And the way her shoulders sagged in relief told him how close she'd been to giving up entirely, how heavy the burden of survival had been on someone so alone. And in the quiet days that followed, as the storm eased and the world outside settled into a frozen stillness, something fragile began to grow between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust, built in small moments, shared meals eaten in silence, the sound of her laughter the first time one of the ranch dogs rested its head on her knee, the careful way she learned the rhythm of the house, always thanking him as if kindness were something that might be taken back at any moment. And Ethan found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, troubled by the way her presence changed the space around him, how the house no longer felt like a tomb, but like a place waiting to be lived in again. And at night, when she slept on the narrow bed and he took the chair by the fire, he wrestled with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself in years, because saving her had been easy compared to what came next, choosing what to do with the life he had pulled back from the edge. And if you've ever wondered how two broken paths can cross in the most unlikely place, stay with this story, because the bond forming here will soon be tested by truth, judgment, and a town that never forgets. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter will change everything. The first stranger arrived 3 days after the storm broke. his wagon creaking up the long drive just as Ethan was mending a fence, and the sound alone was enough to tighten something in his chest, because visitors were rare out here and never accidental. And by the time the man dismounted, Sheriff Miles Carter, heavy coat dusted with snow, eyes sharp beneath a weathered brow, Ethan already knew the quiet he'd built was about to be disturbed. And inside the house, Anya froze when she heard the knock, her body going rigid as fear rushed back into her eyes. The same fear she'd worn in the snow, because she understood instinctively what Ethan had hoped to delay. The outside world had rules, and those rules were rarely kind to women who arrived alone and unclaimed. And when Ethan opened the door, the cold rushed in along with questions. The sheriff offering his condolences for Caleb Turner, mentioning the unanswered mail, the bank inquiries, the unpaid land tax, and then casually, too casually, asking about the woman seen in Ethan's window. And the pause that followed felt heavier than any storm, because in that silence Ethan realized just how thin the line was between protection and exposure, and he answered carefully, saying she was sick, saying she had nowhere else to go, saying only what could not be twisted. But Carter's eyes flicked past him, already measuring, already imagining the story the town would tell. And after the sheriff left with a promise to return, the house felt smaller, the walls closer, the fire weaker somehow. And Anya finally spoke the fear she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest, asking if they would send her away, if she would be punished for something she didn't understand, if answering an advertisement had made her a criminal in this land. And Ethan surprised himself by how quickly his answer came, firm and unyielding, telling her no one would take her anywhere she didn't choose to go, even as he knew that promise might cost him more than he was prepared to pay. Because by the next morning the town was already whispering, wagons slowing as they passed the ranch, eyes lingering, stories growing teeth. And when Ethan rode into town for supplies, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women watched from behind curtains, and men measured him with looks that carried judgment dressed up as concern. And at the general store, someone finally said it aloud, asking what business a lone rancher had sheltering another man's bride, implying things that made Ethan's blood run hot. But he said nothing, paid for his supplies, and left with his jaw locked tight, because violence would only prove them right. And back at the ranch, Anya waited, pretending to be calm, but he could see the way she flinched at every sound, the way she folded herself smaller as if trying to disappear. And that night she told him something she hadn't before, something she'd kept hidden out of shame, that the contract she'd signed left her with no claim, no protection, no right to land or money, that if the town decided she didn't belong, she would be put on the next train with nothing but the clothes she wore. And the thought of that, of her, being swallowed by another place that didn't want her, lit something fierce inside him, something he hadn't felt since he'd buried his wife and sworn never to care again. And as days passed, the pressure mounted. The sheriff returned with paperwork, polite but persistent, asking about arrangements, guardianship, intentions. And when he finally suggested gently that marriage would solve a lot of questions, Ethan felt the weight of every eye in the valley settle onto his shoulders, because the idea was simple on the surface and impossibly complicated underneath. And that night, sitting across from Anya at the small table, he told her the truth that the town would not leave her alone, that kindness without structure frightened people more than cruelty, and that there might be a way to keep her safe. And she listened silently, fingers twisted in her lap, until she understood what he was offering, what he was risking. And tears filled her eyes, not from romance, but from the terrible kindness of a man willing to tie his already broken life to hers, just so she wouldn't be cast out. And she asked him if it would be a lie, and he answered honestly that it would begin as one, but only to the world. And the quiet that followed stretched long and heavy, because both of them understood that some lies change you forever. And as the fire burned low and the wind rose again outside, neither of them slept, knowing the next choice would reshape their lives in ways neither could fully see yet. And if you think survival is just about staying alive, stay with this story, because sometimes it's about choosing who you're willing to stand beside when the world starts watching. And if you want to see how far Ethan and Anya are willing to go, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter brings the choice they can no longer avoid. The morning Ethan asked her was gray and brittle with cold, the kind of morning where sound carried too far and every decision felt carved in ice. And he didn't dress the question up or soften it with false promises, because he had learned long ago that lies wrapped in kindness still cut just as deep. So he told Anya plainly that the sheriff would return within the week, that the town wanted answers written in ink and law, not compassion, and that if she chose to leave, he would take her to the station himself and give her what little money he could spare. But if she chose to stay, the only shield strong enough to protect her would be his name, spoken publicly and without apology. And Anya listened with her hands folded tight, staring at the steam rising from her untouched tea, because the idea of marriage had already betrayed her once, had delivered her into snow and silence and the shadow of death. And yet the man standing in front of her now was not offering ownership or control, only shelter and choice. And when she finally looked up at him, he saw fear there, yes, but also resolve, the kind forged by women who have already survived more than the world ever intended them to. And she asked him what he would lose if he married her. And the question struck deeper than he expected, because the honest answer was everything he'd carefully arranged. His life around, his solitude, his invisibility, the armor of grief that kept him safe from wanting. But instead of listing those things, he told her the truth beneath them, that he would lose the quiet lie that he was finished with living. And she nodded slowly, as if understanding something unsaid, and agreed on one condition, that they would not pretend between themselves, that whatever the world believed, they would be honest in the dark, honest in the small hours, honest about fear and regret and the possibility that this arrangement might change them in ways neither could predict. And Ethan agreed without hesitation, because honesty was the only currency he had left to offer. And when the sheriff returned, clipboard tucked under his arm and questions ready, Ethan spoke before he could ask any, stating clearly that Anya was his intended, that the wedding would take place before the end of the month, and that her place was here by his side. And the relief that flickered across Carter's face was unmistakable, because neat answers made his job easier, and the town, hungry for certainty, accepted the story with the kind of nodding, approval reserved for things that fit into familiar shapes. Though behind the smiles and congratulations lingered curiosity sharp enough to draw blood, and preparations began quickly. Not out of joy, but necessity, a borrowed dress, a simple ring, a ceremony planned more for witnesses than celebration. And through it all, Ethan and Anya moved carefully around each other, learning the strange intimacy of proximity without expectation, sharing meals, shared work, shared silence, until the night before the wedding arrived heavy and sleepless, and Anya admitted in a trembling voice that she was afraid, not of him, but of hoping, because hope had nearly killed her once. And Ethan answered by telling her about his wife, about the accident, about the promise he'd made to himself never to need anyone again. And in that shared confession something shifted, subtle but irreversible. And when the day came and they stood before the town in a small, drafty hall, vows spoken with steady voices despite pounding hearts, something unexpected happened. Something neither had planned for. The lie held just long enough to become something real, because when Ethan took Anya's hand and said her name, it was not obligation that warmed his chest but purpose. And when she looked at him, eyes shining with tears she did not hide, it was not gratitude alone but trust, and the applause that followed felt distant and unimportant compared to the quiet truth settling between them. That survival had led them here, but choice would decide what came next. And as they rode back to the ranch together, husband and wife in the eyes of the world, the road ahead felt terrifying and open all at once. And if you think the hardest part of a love story is getting together, stay with this one, because the real test begins after the vows. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter will reveal what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. Marriage did not silence the past the way the town seemed to think it would, and within weeks of the ceremony the ghosts Ethan had spent years outrunning began to circle back, stirred awake by the sound of another heartbeat in his house and the unfamiliar comfort of someone waiting for him at day's end. Because love, even cautious, unspoken love, has a way of loosening the ground grief is buried in. And Anya felt it too, though in different ways, waking some nights from dreams of snow swallowing her whole, of doors that would not open, of voices calling her name only to vanish when she answered. And Ethan learned to sit beside her in the dark, not fixing, not explaining, simply staying. Because staying had become the most powerful promise he knew how to keep. Yet the valley was not done testing them, and when spring finally began its slow thaw, bringing mud and memory in equal measure, a letter arrived bearing a seal Ethan had not seen in years. informing him that the land dispute tied to his wife's death, dismissed, forgotten, or so he'd believed, had been reopened due to a clerical error. And the implication was clear. Someone questioned his right to the ranch itself, the very ground beneath their fragile new beginning. And when word spread, the town's tone shifted, sympathy curdling into speculation. Old rumors resurfacing about the accident, about whether Ethan had been careless, about whether grief had driven him reckless. And Anya saw how the whispers cut him deeper than open hostility ever could. Saw how he withdrew, how silence crept back into his shoulders like a familiar coat. And for the first time since she'd been saved from the snow, she felt truly afraid, not of being sent away, but of losing him to the past he refused to share fully. And so she did something brave and dangerous, something born of desperation and devotion, riding into town alone to confront the truth head-on, speaking to people who had already judged her, asking questions others were afraid to ask, piecing together a story of envy, greed, and a neighbor who had coveted Ethan's land for years, using tragedy as leverage. And when Ethan discovered what she'd done, fear turned to anger before breaking apart into something raw and unguarded. Because no one had ever fought for him that way before. No one had chosen him so fiercely. And in the argument that followed, voices raised, truth spilled, walls finally came down. Ethan admitting that he had survived his wife's death but never forgiven himself for living on. Anya confessing that being unwanted had shaped her more deeply than hunger ever had. And in that painful honesty they found something stronger than protection or obligation. Something earned, and as the legal battle loomed and the town watched closely, waiting to see if this strange marriage would fracture under pressure, Ethan and Anya stood together at the edge of everything they might lose, finally understanding that survival had brought them this far. But love, real love, would demand courage neither of them had known they possessed. And if you've ever wondered whether broken people can build something unbreakable together, stay with this story, because the final chapter will answer that question in a way you won't forget. And make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next is the moment that defines them forever. The hearing took place on a morning so bright it felt almost cruel, sunlight spilling over the valley as if daring anyone to believe in renewal. And Ethan stood beside Anya in the small county office with hands clasped not out of fear but resolve. Because somewhere along the way this fight had stopped being about land or legality and had become about whether the world would allow two broken people to keep the life they had chosen together. And as testimony unfolded, records produced, lies exposed, the truth of the old dispute finally dragged into the open. It became clear that greed had worn grief like a disguise, that the accident had been twisted for profit. And when the ruling came down in Ethan's favor, the relief was quiet, almost solemn, because victory did not erase the years of loneliness that had preceded it. But it did something just as important. It closed a door that had haunted him for far too long. And when they returned to the ranch that evening, the snow was gone at last, grass pushing through thawed earth, calves wobbling on new legs, the land breathing again. And Anya stood at the edge of the field taking it all in with tears in her eyes. Because for the first time since leaving her homeland, she was not surviving someone else's choices but living inside her own. And Ethan watched her from the porch, realizing with a sudden, steady certainty that home was no longer a place defined by absence, but by presence, by the sound of her voice calling him in for supper, by the quiet way she rested her head against his shoulder at night, by the shared labor and shared dreams, neither of them rushed to name, but both protected fiercely. And when the town slowly softened, curiosity giving way to acceptance, suspicion to respect, it wasn't because Ethan demanded it or Anya begged for it, but because love, when lived honestly, has a way of reshaping even the hardest landscapes. And years later, people would still talk about the winter that nearly killed her, about the rancher who stopped for a mailbox everyone else ignored. But what they remembered most was what came after. The way two lives written off as finished found a future in the thaw. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion can arrive at the last possible moment and still be enough, then carry it with you, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that begins in the snow and survives the spring.